Hi everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism and narcissistic relationships. Today, I'm going to be answering a question that someone sent in, and that question is, ready? What happens when a grandiose narcissist gets into a relationship with a vulnerable/covert narcissist, right? So when the grandiose and the vulnerable or covert narcissist get together, what happens? I'd love for you to drop some of your answers in the comments. And before I get to that, just a gentle reminder, if you haven't yet, please do go check out my new podcast, Navigating Narcissism. Not even so new anymore. You can get details in the video notes, and you can listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. So let's talk about this. What happens? Grandiose narcissist, vulnerable narcissist, they get into a relationship. What happens? So, for starters, you may be wondering, why should I care? Oh, well, because this may have been your parents. Or you may know people in this situation, or you may have one of these personality styles and are wondering about your own partner. But I do think that many of you may be wondering if this is what you grew up with. This particular video idea came in from a couple of people, but one in particular, someone who specifically sent in a question that touched on this, and it evolved into this larger video concept. Now, this combination of the grandiose and the vulnerable narcissist in the same relationship is a tough combination. It's sort of the complementary sides of narcissism coming together in one relationship. The grandiose narcissistic person is the one who needs all of the attention in the relationship. If there's a grandiose narcissist in a relationship, then there is typically room for only one of you, and that's them. They need all of the validation, all of the admiration, all of the attention, and they will be domineering and selfish, and things in the family or activities in the family or anything in the family or the relationship or company run the way they want. You have to eat when they want, vacation where they want, schedules are the way they want, everything's the way they want. Their charm and charisma mean that lots of people may like them or be drawn to them. The attraction in some ways for a grandiose narcissistic person is clear. And again, if these are your parents, the grandiose narcissistic parent was most likely the dominant parent. And as the whole narcissism thing becomes more clear to you, this will often be the parent where it is readily apparent. Their arrogance, their pretentiousness, their everything has to look just so, their bossiness, it's all there. Now, what if a grandiose narcissist gets into a relationship with a vulnerable narcissist? And again, I know a lot of people call this covert narcissism. Vulnerable is the more accurate term, but they mean the same thing here. Now remember, this is the form of narcissism that's more resentful, sullen, aggrieved, victimized, malcontented, nobody can see how great I am, socially anxious, just grumpy Gus kind of anxious form of narcissism. Lots of passive aggressiveness. These are folks that can even sometimes seem socially awkward and always feel that things never go their way. This is also the form of narcissism where we see similar levels across genders, whereas grandiose narcissism is significantly more common in men. So you may be wondering, how do these two types of narcissism even get together in the first place? The grandiose narcissistic person is so big that there wouldn't really be room for another big personality like that in the relationship. But it is still surprising that these two narcissistic types But it is actually surprising that these two narcissistic types actually do get together. The vulnerable folks tend not to be as big or charismatic or even attention-seeking and can actually be quite glum, which you would think would probably be experienced as sort of a downer by a grandiose narcissistic person. The most likely pathways to these different types of folks even ending up together is that the vulnerable narcissistic person is very attractive or brings some other kind of value add, like money or status. It could be cultural, more of a brokered or arranged marriage where people may not have had as much say or choice, and so these two people were kind of thrown together. I can tell you right now, this is a relationship or a marriage that is not going to work well for long, if ever. The vulnerable narcissistic person within the relationship is chronically feeling victimized and that life isn't fair to them and that they aren't being recognized for their greatness, and they're butting up against the grandiose narcissist who is not only taking their half out of the middle but doesn't like the gloominess and the passive aggression that can often be observed in a vulnerable narcissistic person. The vulnerable narcissistic person may feel like the grandiose narcissist gets all the glory, while the vulnerable narcissistic person gets forgotten or ends up sort of in the cheap seats. The vulnerable narcissistic person may also live in fear of the relationship ending. It's not unusual for them to have pretty marked abandonment fears. And the grandiose person, the fear that the grandiose narcissistic person will abandon them. And this can often lead the vulnerable narcissistic person to behave in an angry, sullen manner, especially if they feel that the grandiose person's not giving them enough attention. Like I said, none of this is pretty. Fights can escalate and get quite noisy and volatile, and the vulnerable narcissistic person will often walk around quite wounded, and the grandiose person will walk around quite put upon. If you grew up like this with two parents like this, there was probably almost no sense of psychological safety. People with these two narcissistic styles would have little interest in their children and their children's wants and needs, and perhaps even resentment toward the children for their mere existence and for their needs independent of the parent. All of this can be quite painful, and it can be quite confusing, because the more vulnerable narcissistic parent, who definitely doesn't have the zazazoo of the grandiose narcissistic parent, the vulnerable narcissistic parent may have evoked pity or even contempt from their children, and the grandiose narcissistic parent might actually evoke a mix of admiration and resentment. None of that feels good for a child who merely wants to get their validation needs met. Over time, it's a lot easier to identify the grandiose narcissistic parent's patterns, but the vulnerable narcissism, it's a lot tougher. And there may be the assumption that the vulnerable narcissistic parent was anxious, depressed, hurt, upset, and that might result in a pull for some of the children in these families to feel guilty or to take care of the vulnerable narcissistic parent, which then would be that sort of supply for that parent. We do need to be cautious. Sometimes the other parent, the non-grandiose narcissistic one, is not a vulnerable narcissist, but may just be a massive enabler, doing a lot of going along with little regard for how much the grandiose narcissistic parent's behavior is hurting the children in the family. The enabler parent may not be narcissistic, but their empathy may have been attenuated or clipped by trying to be all things to the narcissistic parent. The enabler parent may not have their own independent, sort of separate manifestation of entitlement or grandiosity or validation seeking, and they're largely acting as a puppet of the narcissistic parent. Now, this is little comfort to a child who learns that their needs are secondary to those of their narcissistic parent. When you do have one big, loud, attention-grabbing narcissistic parent, it can obscure being able to clearly see other narcissistic patterns within a family, perhaps in another parent or grandparents or other extended family members. Ultimately, the label doesn't really matter that much. It's the patterns that matter. And if they are invalidating, manipulative, gaslighting, devaluing, dismissive, then call it whatever you want. The patterns were not and are not good for you. And if you were getting both forms from two different parents, that is a tough childhood and can really set someone up at high risk for maintaining trauma-bonded relationships well into adulthood. If any of you had that combination of parenting, you ought to drop it in the comments because it's a rough ride. Thanks again.